Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Daniel Mercer had learned years ago not to mention the feeling to other rangers. The prickling awareness that slid across his shoulders like cold water. The way certain sections of trail seemed to whisper warnings before anything visibly wrong appeared. His ex-wife had called it anxiety, his first supervisor had suggested stress leave, and Daniel had stopped talking about it altogether. But on the morning of October 12, 2007, as he drove his Park Service truck up the fog-shrouded access road to the Hoh River trailhead, that familiar sensation crawled up his spine with an intensity he'd never experienced before. Something in the forest was awake, and it was paying attention. The Olympic National Park stretched across nearly 1 million acres of Washington's western peninsula, but the Hoh rainforest remained its primordial heart. Trees here grew to impossible heights, their trunks thick as small houses, draped in moss that hung like the beards of ancient prophets. Nurse logs decomposed across decades, becoming gardens for new growth in the perpetual twilight beneath the canopy. Daniel had worked these trails for 8 years, and the forest's age never stopped affecting him. The weight of centuries pressed into every square foot of soil. His Motorola radio crackled as he parked. "Ranger Mercer, this is dispatch. You copy?" "Copy, Sarah. I'm at Hoh River trailhead now. We got the vehicle registration back. Silver Subaru Outback belongs to Jessica Morrison, 26, from Seattle. Reported overdue by her roommate yesterday evening. Should have been back Tuesday, today's Thursday." Daniel stepped out of his truck, the October air immediately dampening his uniform with mist. Jessica Morrison's Subaru sat alone in the gravel lot, a fine layer of moisture beating across its windows. Any notes on her hiking plan? Roommate says she was planning the Hoh River to Blue Glacier route. 4 days, experienced hiker, all proper gear. But Daniel, Sarah's voice dropped slightly. Roommate mentioned Jessica had been, she used the word obsessed with finding something in the forest, some kind of research project. Wouldn't explain what. The sensation across Daniel's shoulders intensified. He approached the Subaru, peering through the windows, empty protein bar wrappers in the passenger seat, a University of Washington parking permit on the mirror, a hiking guide to Olympic National Park dog-eared on the dashboard. Normal. Everything looked completely normal. Except. Daniel circled the vehicle slowly, that unexplainable awareness prickling stronger with each step. The moss on the surrounding trees seemed to lean toward the car, not swaying in wind, there was no wind, but oriented, like gallery observers studying a painting. The fog pressed closer here than anywhere else in the lot, and when Daniel placed his palm on the Subaru's hood, the metal was cold. Too cold. Cold like it had been parked for weeks, not days. "I'm heading up the trail," he radioed, "starting at 0847 hours. He checked his gear with practiced efficiency. Garmin GPS unit, first aid kit, emergency beacon, water filtration, rope, his father's old compass that still worked better than any digital device. His agency-issue Motorola had limited range in the deep forest, but it was better than nothing. 2007 technology meant his cell phone was essentially a useless brick once he got a mile from the trailhead. The Hoh River trail entrance yawned before him like a throat. Daniel had walked this path hundreds of times. He knew every switchback, every landmark, every quirk of the route. But as he stepped beneath the canopy, that knowledge felt suddenly inadequate. The moss hung differently. The light fell wrong. And the silence. The forest was never this quiet. Even in October, even in fog, there should be birds, squirrels, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth. Instead, nothing. Just his boots on damp earth and the whisper of his own breathing. The trail followed the milky blue Hoh River for the first several miles, the glacial water rushing over stones worn smooth by millennia. Normally the sound created a natural white noise that Daniel found meditative. Today it sounded like warnings, like urgent voices speaking a language just beyond comprehension. He found the first sign at mile marker 2.3. Jessica's hiking pole, top of the line black diamond, partially buried in moss beside the trail. Daniel photographed it with his digital camera before bagging it as evidence. The pole showed no damage, no signs of struggle, simply abandoned or dropped, or... His thought process stopped, because carved into the moss beside where the pole had lain was a symbol Daniel didn't recognize. Not carved recently, the moss had already begun healing over the marks, but deliberate. 3 interlocking circles with lines radiating outward like a child's drawing of the sun. Except the proportions were wrong, the angles slightly off in a way that made Daniel's eyes water if he looked too long. Dispatch, this is Mercer. Found evidence at mile 2.3 continuing north. Static answered him. Daniel checked his radio. Full battery, antenna extended. He tried again. More static, and beneath it, something that might have been Sarah's voice, or might have been the wind through branches, or might have been something else entirely, forming syllables in that almost language. The GPS showed his position accurately. 47.8604 degree N, 123.9351 degree W, elevation 578 feet. The trail stretched ahead, exactly where it should be. Everything was correct. Everything was wrong. Daniel had felt uneasy on searches before. He'd experienced the forest's moods, its shifts between welcoming and indifferent. But this was different. This felt like being watched by something that understood he didn't belong here, that none of them belonged here. At mile 3.7, he found Jessica's backpack. It sat in the center of the trail, perfectly upright as if someone had carefully placed it there. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he approached. The pack was a Gregory Diva 70, still clipped and buckled, showing no signs of damage or struggle. He opened it slowly, documenting each item: camping stove, unused, sleeping bag, dry, 4 days of freeze-dried meals, untouched, water filter, clean. Her wallet contained her driver's license. Jessica Morrison stared out from the photo, dark hair pulled back, slight smile, eyes that suggested intelligence and determination. But tucked into a side pocket, Daniel found a small leather journal. The first few pages contained normal hiking notes, weather observations, wildlife sightings, elevation gains. Then the handwriting changed, became more cramped, more urgent. Daniel flipped to the most recent entry, dated Monday, October 8th, 4 days ago. Found another one, 5th marker since entering the old growth section. The patterns are consistent with the folklore I researched, Eastern European, specifically Carpathian. Dr. Valescu was right. The trees here are arranged, not naturally. Someone, something, has been shaping this forest for longer than the Park Service records acknowledge. The moss grows in spirals around certain trunks. The nurse logs form geometric patterns when viewed from above. Need to check satellite imagery. I'm getting close to the center. I can feel it. The forest feels it too. It knows I'm here. The next page showed sketches. The same 3 interlocking circles Daniel had seen carved in moss, along with other symbols. Annotations in what looked like phonetic spellings of unfamiliar words. Leshy, Leshy, guardian patterns. The final entry, Tuesday morning. Last night I heard them walking. Footsteps that don't match any animal I know. Too heavy for elk, too deliberate for bear. Circling my camp but never approaching. When I shined my flashlight, the trees were closer than they'd been when I set up the tent. I know that sounds crazy. I measured. But I'm not leaving. Not when I'm this close. If I'm right, this changes everything we understand about... The entry ended mid-sentence. Daniel's mouth had gone dry. He looked up from the journal, really looked at the forest around him. The Sitka spruce towering overhead, some 6 feet in diameter, stretching 200 feet toward a sky he could barely see. The western hemlock clustered in families, the big leaf maple draped in moss like ceremonial robes, and between them, the space seemed to shift. Distances that should remain constant appeared to fluctuate, as if the forest was breathing. His GPS still showed his position correctly. But when Daniel looked back the way he'd come, the trail seemed narrower, the trees closer together, like a gap slowly closing. "Jessica Morrison." His voice fell dead in the fog, absorbed by moss and bark without echo. "NPS search and rescue. If you can hear me, respond." Silence. Then from somewhere impossibly far away and impossibly close, a sound like branches creaking, like wooden joints flexing, like the forest settling its weight. Daniel marked the backpack's location with flagging tape and continued north, following the trail toward the higher elevations where old growth gave way to alpine meadows and eventually the Blue Glacier. But with each step, that wrongness intensified. The trail markers appeared at odd intervals now, too frequent, then too sparse. Blazes on trees showed up on the wrong side of trunks, and the moss, everywhere the moss seemed to form patterns that Daniel's peripheral vision caught but couldn't quite see when he looked directly. At 247 feet elevation, the trail forked. Daniel stopped. He'd hiked this route dozens of times. There was no fork here. The Hoh River Trail was a single path until it reached Elk Lake at 3,950 feet. But ahead of him, clear as anything, the trail split. The left fork showed obvious signs of use: packed earth, broken twigs, boot prints, and soft soil. The right fork looked older, dimmer, like a path the forest was slowly reclaiming but hadn't quite finished erasing. His compass spun lazily, unable to settle on north. The GPS flickered, then showed his position as 47.8723 degree N, 123.95 on 21 degree W. Correct coordinates for this elevation, but now with a second blinking dot appearing and disappearing half a mile northwest. No identification, just a phantom signal in the forest. Daniel took the left fork. The path felt right, looked maintained. But within 50 yards, the trees closed overhead until he was walking through a tunnel of green twilight. The trail climbed steeply, roots forming natural stairs, moss making each step treacherous, and carved into tree after tree, those same symbols from Jessica's journal, the interlocking circles, the radiating lines, fresh moss growth over old marks, suggesting the carvings had been here for years, decades, centuries. How had he never noticed them before? The forest sounds changed, no longer silent, but filled with creaking that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Wood grinding against wood, the slow groan of growing things that shouldn't make noise, and beneath it, a rhythm, like breathing, like a pulse. Daniel's radio crackled suddenly. "Sir, Dan, can you, the trees." "Sarah? Say again, you're breaking up." "Not where you think, trail, changing, get out." Static consumed the transmission. Daniel checked his watch. 11:34 a.m. He'd been hiking for less than 3 hours but had only covered maybe 4 miles. That was wrong. He should be at nearly 8 miles by now. The forest was slowing him down, stretching distances, making miles into marathons. He found Jessica's tent at what his GPS insisted was 1,890 feet elevation. The campsite sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient cedars, their bark hanging in long strips like tattered fabric. The tent, a Mountain Hardware two-person, stood intact, fly properly secured, stakes driven deep. But it sat at the center of a pattern that made Daniel's stomach clench. The trees formed a perfect circle around the clearing, not approximately circular, but geometrically precise, their trunks exactly equidistant from the tent. The moss on each trunk spiraled counterclockwise, every spiral matching the others. And between the trees, the undergrowth had been cleared, not cut, but moved aside, as if something had carefully arranged the ferns and salal into neat borders. Daniel approached the tent slowly. "Jessica, it's Park Service. I'm coming in." The tent's mesh door hung open. Inside, a sleeping bag still in its stuff sack, an empty water bottle, and carved into the tent floor's waterproof fabric, another symbol. This one more complex, circles within circles, lines connecting in patterns that hurt to follow, and words scratched in shaking letters. "They're not trees, they're watching, they remember everything." Daniel backed out of the tent, his heart hammering. The clearing felt smaller now, the circle of trees closer, and in his peripheral vision the cedars seemed to lean inward, their tops bending at angles that defied what wood should do. That's when he heard the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, moving through underbrush without rustling leaves, over ground without snapping twigs, circling the clearing in the space between the trees where shadow pooled thickest. Daniel spun, trying to locate the source, but the sound came from everywhere, all around him. Multiple sources, or one thing moving impossibly fast, or... The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Daniel heard breathing. Not his own. Something large, measured, ancient, the exhalation of lungs made from heartwood and sap. And then, for just a moment, he saw it. Not clearly. His mind refused to make sense of the shape between two cedars. Something tall and angular and wrong, composed of branch and bark and moss, but arranged in a form that suggested posture, purpose, awareness. Eyes that weren't eyes watched him from a face that wasn't a face. And behind the first shape, others. Dozens. Hundreds. The forest itself, rearranged into guardians. Leshy. The word from Jessica's journal surfaced in Daniel's mind. Forest lords. Guardians of wild places. They weren't trees pretending to be watchers. They were watchers who had always been trees. Daniel's legs moved before his conscious mind made the decision. He ran. Back toward the trail, back toward lower elevations, back toward the trailhead and civilization, and the world where trees stayed rooted and forests didn't breathe. Behind him, the footsteps followed. Not chasing exactly. Herding. The trail twisted impossibly. Switchbacks appeared where none should exist. The forest thickened, thinned, rearranged itself like a maze solving itself around him. Daniel's GPS showed his position jumping, 400 feet, then 900 feet, then 600 feet, elevation changing faster than he could possibly climb or descend. His compass spun wildly, and the trees, God. The trees moved in his peripheral vision, repositioning themselves, closing gaps, opening new paths that led deeper into territory that had never appeared on any map. He burst into a clearing he didn't recognize. An ancient nurse log stretched across the space, its massive trunk supporting a garden of young hemlocks, their roots diving into the decaying wood. And sitting on that log, staring at something in her hands, was Jessica Morrison. She looked up as Daniel stumbled to a halt. Her face was gaunt, eyes sunken, lips cracked from dehydration, but alive, conscious, watching him with an expression that mixed relief and terror, and something else. Knowledge. Terrible, unwanted knowledge. "You shouldn't have come," Jessica said. Her voice rasped. "They let me stay because I understood, but you... We need to leave, now. I have water, supplies. Can you walk?" Jessica laughed, a sound like wind through hollow wood. "Walk? Daniel, that is your name, right? It's on your badge, there's no leaving. There never was. The moment we entered the old growth, we entered their territory. The forest doesn't end where the map says it ends. It ends when they let us leave." Daniel activated his emergency beacon, the bright orange device sending its distress signal into the fog. "Help is coming. We just need to hold our position until... They won't find us. You know that. You've felt it since you started the trail, the wrongness. You're sensitive, aren't you? You perceive what others don't." Jessica stood unsteadily, and Daniel saw her hiking boots were wrapped in moss, growing moss, spreading across the leather like infection. "I came here to prove they existed, the Leshy, the forest guardians from Carpathian folklore. My dissertation was on the migration of European myths to American forests. I thought it was metaphor, ancestral memory encoded in story. Jessica, you're in shock. Let me help you. I'm the clearest I've ever been." She held up what she'd been examining, a piece of bark covered in carved symbols. "These marks predate European settlement, predate Native American habitation. They're old, Daniel, old as the trees themselves. Because the Leshy are the trees. They're what happens when a forest grows ancient enough to remember, to think, to protect itself. The clearing darkened, though Daniel's watch showed only 1:47 p.m. The trees surrounding them leaned inward, their tops meeting overhead in a canopy that blocked even the diffuse October light. And Daniel saw clearly now what his mind had refused to process before. The trees weren't arranged randomly. They formed letters, shapes. When viewed from above, impossible unless you could fly, unless you could see as the forest itself saw. They spelled out warnings in a language predating English, predating Latin, predating any human tongue. The forest was a grimoire written in wood and time. The Carpathian Leshy protect their forest by leading trespassers astray, Jessica continued, her voice taking on a lecturer's rhythm despite her deteriorated state. They make familiar paths strange. They close trails behind intruders. And for those who refuse to leave, who insist on penetrating the deepest old growth. She gestured at her moss-covered boots. They make you part of what you sought to violate. Daniel grabbed her arm, feeling how cold her skin had become. I don't care about folklore, I care about getting you medical attention. Move. Now. They ran. The forest erupted around them. Trees shifted like chess pieces, roots breaking through soil to form barriers, branches reaching down with wooden fingers. The footsteps returned, thunderous now, no longer bothering with subtlety. Daniel could see them clearly in his peripheral vision. The Leshy, dozens of them, forms built from living wood, eyes made of knothole shadow, mouths opening in the splits of bark. They moved between trees because they were trees, because they'd always been there, because the forest and its guardians were the same thing seen from different angles. Jessica fell, her moss-wrapped boots tripping on suddenly risen roots. Daniel hauled her up and saw the moss had spread to her calves now, threading through her pant fabric, seeking purchase on flesh. They're making me a marker, she gasped. Like the trees they've transformed before. I'll stand here for centuries warning other trespassers. That's what all those ancient trees are, Daniel. The really old ones, the ones that feel aware. They're not just trees. They're what's left of people who went too deep. Daniel's radio shrieked with interference. Through the static he heard voices, but not Sarah's, not any human voice. These spoke in creaks and groans and the sound of growing rings adding layers year by year. And underneath, words in that almost language, Kranitel, Guardian. This place is ours, has always been ours. His GPS screen cracked, showing impossible readings. His compass shattered. The emergency beacon's orange light flickered and died. All his technology, all his modern tools, rendered useless by something that existed before tools, before technology, before humanity decided these mountains could be parceled into parks and trails. They burst onto what Daniel prayed was the actual trail, the maintained path that would lead down to the trailhead. But the forest had rearranged itself. The trail now climbed instead of descended, leading deeper into old growth, toward the heart of the forest where the truly ancient trees grew. A wall of Leshy blocked the downward path, not metaphorical, an actual wall of transformed wood. Guardians standing shoulder to shoulder, their bark faces impassive, their branch arms crossed. Behind Daniel, more gathered, forming a corridor with only one direction, up. They're giving us a choice, Jessica said. She'd stopped struggling, acceptance settling over her features like moss. Turn back now, leave their territory, forget what we've seen, or continue forward. See what's at the center. Understand. What's at the center? Jessica smiled, and in her eyes Daniel saw a reflection of impossible knowledge. The first one, the one that's been here since the glaciers retreated, the one that taught the forest to remember, the one all the folklore warns about, in every culture, every continent, every human story. The thing we've always known exists in the deepest woods but told ourselves was just metaphor. The Leshy waited. The forest waited. Time itself seemed to pause, stretched between heartbeats, giving Daniel this single moment to choose. His training said to retreat, call for backup with proper equipment, return with a full SAR team and helicopters and overwhelming force. His sensitivity, that thing he'd spent years denying, said it wouldn't matter. That no amount of force moved a mountain, and you couldn't force something that was the mountain. Daniel thought of his truck in the parking lot, his empty apartment in Port Angeles, his ex-wife who'd left because she couldn't live with someone who heard things that weren't there, saw things that shouldn't exist, his daughter who barely knew him because visits were too awkward, too filled with the unspoken gap between what Daniel perceived and what others believed. What was waiting for him back in that world, really? "Show me," he said. The Leshy parted. The corridor opened. Jessica took his hand, her skin bark rough now, her fingers lengthening into twigs, and together they climbed. The trail led to a place that existed on no map, in a section of forest that park records insisted was thoroughly surveyed. But Daniel knew better now. Some places couldn't be surveyed. Some territories belonged to themselves, allowed no claims, recognized no ownership beyond ancient right. The trees here grew different, larger than any Sitka spruce, older than carbon dating could measure. Their trunks formed patterns, spirals, circles, geometric perfection that suggested conscious design over millennia. The moss hung so thick it created curtains, and when Daniel pushed through them, he saw the center. A tree that was more than tree. Massive beyond reason, its trunk easily 40 feet in diameter, its height lost in perpetual fog. But in its bark, Daniel saw faces. Hundreds of them. Thousands, carved or grown or transformed, visages that had once been human, now incorporated into living wood. Their eyes were knot-hole dark, their mouths opened in permanent silent words, and through each face, sap ran like tears or blood or whatever trees wept when they remembered being flesh. The first Leshy, Jessica whispered beside him. She was less human now, more tree, her transformation accelerating in the presence of this ancient power. It was human once, a guardian, a shaman, a protector who understood these forests before they were forests. Before the ice retreated, it made a choice, become part of what it protected, and it's been teaching the forest how to protect itself ever since. Every person who goes too deep, who sees too much, who won't leave, the forest remembers them, incorporates them, makes them guardians. Daniel stared at the faces in the bark. Some wore expressions of terror, others peace, many something between. And as he watched, one face near the base opened eyes that had been closed for perhaps decades, perhaps centuries. It looked at him directly and spoke in a voice like rustling leaves. Choose. The word echoed through the clearing, through Daniel's skull, through everything he understood about the world. One word containing infinite meaning. Stay or leave. Become or remain. Join the eternal watch or return to brief mortality. Understand completely or live in ignorance. Jessica was almost gone now, her body more wood than flesh. Roots spreading from her feet into the earth, branches beginning to sprout from her shoulders. But she smiled, her last human expression before transformation completed. I choose to understand, she said. I choose to remember. I choose to guard what deserves guarding. Daniel felt the offer in his bones. The forest could take him, make him aware in a way his human sensitivity only hinted at. He could stand here for millennia, perceiving everything, knowing everything, protecting everything. Or he could turn away, forget, return to a world that wouldn't believe, return to isolation among his own kind. He looked at Jessica's face, already becoming bark, already taking her place among the ancient guardians. He looked at the Leshy surrounding the clearing, silent witnesses to a ritual older than human history. He looked at his own hands, still human, still vulnerable, still temporary. I choose, Daniel said slowly, to remember without becoming. Silence. Then, impossibly, acceptance. The ancient tree's voice came again. You are sensitive. You perceive. You will carry our warning. Tell them. The forests remember. Tell them. We guard what grows here. Tell them. Go no deeper than we allow. Tell them. Some places belong to themselves. The Leshy parted. The corridor reopened. but leading down now, toward lower elevation, toward the trailhead. Daniel walked. Each step felt like moving through syrup, through time made thick. Jessica remained behind, rooted, transforming, becoming another face in the ancient bark, another consciousness woven into the forest's eternal awareness. Daniel walked for hours or days or minutes. Time moved strangely here, stretched and compressed by inhuman perception. When he finally stumbled into the parking lot, his truck sat exactly where he'd left it. The October sun hung at what his shattered watch insisted was 3:15 p.m., though he'd been in the forest for what felt like weeks. His radio crackled. "Mercer, Daniel, please respond. We've had teams searching for you. Your emergency beacon activated, but we couldn't get a fix on your position. Are you injured?" Daniel stared at the forest behind him. The trees stood normal now, properly spaced, their moss hanging naturally. The trail entrance yawned innocently, like nothing had happened, like the forest was just a forest subject to human mapping and human understanding and human claim. But Daniel knew, would always know. "Mercer here, negative on injuries. What could he say? What words existed to explain? "I lost the trail, got turned around. Jessica Morrison is..." His throat closed. "She's gone. Became part of the forest. You won't find her." Static, confusion in Sarah's voice. "Daniel, say again. You're not making sense. Meet the team at..." He got in his truck, started the engine, drove down the access road without looking back. Because if he looked back, he'd see them watching. The Leshy, the Guardians, the ancient awareness that had always been there, that would always be there, that tolerated human presence only at its pleasure. Daniel Mercer returned to his apartment, filed his report, attended the debriefings where he told carefully edited lies about what happened to Jessica Morrison. Lost in difficult terrain, probable fall, body not recovered. He accepted administrative leave. Saw the therapist who prescribed medications Daniel didn't take because they dulled the sensitivity he now understood was gift and curse in equal measure. He never hiked the Hoh River Trail again. Never needed to, because some part of him remained in that clearing, standing before that ancient tree, understanding what most people spent their lives safely ignorant of. The forests remember. The deep places guard themselves. And humanity's dominion extends only as far as older powers permit. On October nights when fog rolls through Port Angeles, Daniel sometimes hears footsteps outside his window. Measured, deliberate, too heavy for human feet. And he knows they're checking, making sure he remembers his promise, making sure he tells the warning. Some territories belong to themselves. Some places existed before us and will exist after us. And deep in Olympic National Park, where the Sitka spruce grow ancient and the moss hangs like ceremonial shrouds, the Leshy still walk, still guard, still transform those who refuse to leave into eternal watchers. Jessica Morrison's face joined the others in the bark of that impossible tree. And somewhere in the forest's eternal memory, she perceives everything, remembers everything, guards everything, forever. Daniel wakes sometimes from dreams where he's sprouting roots, where moss threads through his skin, where the forest calls him home. And on those mornings, he has to check his boots for signs of growth, his arms for bark patches, his eyes in the mirror to make sure they're still human and not knothole dark. The invitation remains open, the choice still his to make. Stay human and remember, or return and understand completely. The forest is patient. The forest has time. The forest always wins. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories that will haunt you. Which moment scared you most? The moss growing on Jessica, the faces in the ancient tree, or the realization that the Leshy might still be watching Daniel? Share your theory about whether he'll eventually return to the forest. Glacier National Park, October 2007. The call came through at 11:47 p.m., crackling with static over the Motorola radio that Chris Brennan had been staring at for the past hour without really seeing it. He'd been sitting in his cabin at the Apgar Ranger Station, nursing lukewarm coffee and watching the October wind strip the last leaves from the aspens outside his window, when dispatch broke the silence. "Brennan, you copy? We've got a missing person, wildlife researcher. 28-year-old female hasn't checked in for 48 hours. Last known location near the old limestone caves off Grinnell Glacier Trail." Chris set down his mug with deliberate care, watching the brown liquid tremble in concentric circles. His hand was steady, had been steady for 8 years now, ever since he'd stopped letting it shake. "Copy that. Name? Rachel Hoffman. She was studying bat colonies. Had a permit for the cave system. Sheriff's office is stretched thin with that pileup on Highway 2, so it's on us. Bats. Caves. Of course it was caves." Chris pressed the transmit button, his thumb finding the familiar groove worn into the plastic. "I'll head out at first light. Get me her research itinerary and emergency contacts." "Roger, Brennan." Dispatch hesitated, and Chris could hear the younger man's uncertainty bleeding through the static. "That's rough country up there this time of year. First snow came early. You want backup?" "I'll assess when I get there." Chris released the button before dispatch could argue. He knew what they were thinking at headquarters. 43 years old, 17 years with the Park Service, and still taking solo assignments into the backcountry when most rangers his age had moved to desk work or training positions. Still volunteering for searches and rescues like he had something to prove. Maybe he did. Chris stood and began pulling gear from the storage locker in the corner. His movements were automatic, practiced. The same ritual he'd performed dozens of times before. Garmin GPS unit, though the satellite coverage was spotty in the high country. Motorola two-way radio with extra batteries, first aid kit, emergency bivouac, climbing rope. The checklist was burned into his muscle memory, a liturgy of preparedness that had saved lives. Usually, he paused with his hand on the climbing harness, feeling the familiar weight of nylon and carabiners. The equipment couldn't tell him why he'd stopped 6 feet from the edge of Avalanche Gorge on September 17, 1999. Couldn't explain the sudden certainty that had frozen him in place while Marcus Chen had kept climbing, following the signals from the lost hiker's emergency beacon. The beacon they'd never found. Neither had they found Marcus, despite 3 weeks of intensive searching. The official report listed it as a climbing accident, equipment failure, though they'd never recovered enough evidence to be sure. Chris had testified at the inquiry that he'd seen nothing unusual, heard nothing wrong. He'd lied. What he'd actually seen, what he thought he'd seen in those last moments before Marcus disappeared around the granite outcropping, made no sense in daylight, written in official reports. A shadow that moved against the wind. The shape of something massive shifting behind the waterfall's spray. Marcus's voice cutting off mid-word, not with a scream, but with a sound like surprise. He'd learned to stop talking about it after the department psychologist had used words like survivor's guilt and traumatic projection. He'd learned to show up for work, to lead other searches, to write reports that stuck to observable facts. He'd learned to live with the weight of knowing that hesitation had cost his partner's life, even if he couldn't articulate what had made him hesitate. 8 years. He'd been doing this for 8 years. This was just another search. Chris finished packing his gear and checked the weather report on his desktop computer, the boxy monitor casting a blue glow across his desk. The forecast showed temperatures dropping to 15 degrees Fahrenheit overnight, with a 30% chance of additional snow. Rachel Hoffman had been missing for 48 hours. If she was injured or trapped, hypothermia was the primary concern. If she'd fallen into one of the limestone sinkholes that riddled the area, extraction would require technical climbing gear and possibly a helicopter evacuation. He printed out the topographic maps and studied the terrain. The caves off Grinnell Glacier Trail were part of an old limestone formation that predated the glacial period, carved out by ancient water flow and expanded by centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. They weren't on the official park maps, too unstable, too unmapped. But researchers occasionally got permits to study the bat populations that hibernated there. Big brown bats mostly, some little browns. They'd be starting their winter torpor now, clustering in the deepest chambers where temperature and humidity remained constant. Chris traced the trail route with his finger, 7 miles to the cave system from the nearest access point, with an elevation gain of 1,600 feet. Difficult but manageable terrain. Rachel would have been carrying standard field research equipment, headlamp, notebook, possibly a mist net for catching specimens. If she'd gone deep into the caves to count roosting populations, there were a dozen ways things could go wrong. A slip on wet limestone, a ceiling collapse, disorientation in the darkness. He pulled Rachel's file from the fax machine. Montana State University, graduate program in wildlife biology. Her faculty advisor had described her as exceptionally competent and meticulous about safety protocols. The attached photo showed a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, smiling in front of a research poster about white nose syndrome in hibernating bat populations. Her eyes were bright with the kind of enthusiasm that came from genuinely loving your work. Chris had seen that expression before, on Marcus's face, right before they'd headed out on that last search. He shook his head, forcing the comparison away. This was different. Rachel was a missing researcher, not a ranger. The circumstances were completely different. There was no reason to expect. The radio crackled again. "Brennan, one more thing. Local sheriff's office passed along something weird. A couple of the old-timers in Columbia Falls have been talking about those caves. Apparently there's some old immigrant folklore associated with the area. Eastern European, Romanian maybe. The deputies thought it was just superstitious nonsense, but what? One of the old guys, Pete Moldovan, his grandfather, helped dig some of the mining shafts up that way in the 1910s. He says his grandfather used to tell stories about things that lived in the deep caves. Said they brought them over from the old country, or maybe they were already here, waiting. Pete wanted to know if we'd found any." Static broke up the transmission. "Unusual markings. Said we should look for symbols scratched into stone." Chris felt something cold settle in his stomach. What kind of symbols? He couldn't say exactly. Said his grandfather would draw them sometimes when he was drunk, protective signs. Against more static. Strigoi. That's what Pete called them. Strigoi. The word felt wrong in his mouth when Chris tried to repeat it. The syllables harsh and foreign. What's that mean? Pete said it's like vampires, kind of, but not the Dracula stuff. The real old folklore. Dead things that come back wrong, that hunt in the dark. He said if we found any evidence of them, we should burn the bodies and salt the earth. Dispatch laughed uncomfortably. "I know it sounds crazy. Thought you should know what the locals are saying, though, in case Rachel heard any of these stories and got spooked." "Appreciated," Chris said, though his hand had tightened on the radio until his knuckles went white. "I'll keep it in mind." After he signed off, Chris sat in the darkness of his cabin for a long time, listening to the wind. He told himself he was just being thorough when he added extra batteries to his pack, when he double-checked his emergency flares, when he made sure his buck knife was sharp enough to split kindling. He told himself the unease crawling up his spine was just the memory of Marcus, just the normal apprehension before a difficult search in dangerous terrain. He told himself he didn't believe in strigoi, in vampires, in anything that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena and human error. But he still added a headlamp with fresh batteries and triple-checked his first aid kit for the smelling salts and pressure bandages, the things you needed when dealing with blood loss and shock. Just in case. Just to be prepared. That's what rangers did. They prepared for every contingency, even the ones that made no logical sense. At 5:15 a.m., Chris loaded his pack into the Park Service pickup truck and headed north toward the trailhead. The sky was still dark, starless, pregnant with the promise of more snow. His headlights cut through the pre-dawn gloom, illuminating the yellow eyes of a doe standing at the roadside. She watched him pass without moving, without blinking, her breath steaming in the cold air. Chris couldn't shake the feeling that she was waiting for something. The trailhead parking lot was empty except for a single vehicle, a white Subaru Outback with Montana State University parking stickers and a bumper sticker that read, "Bats need friends too." Rachel's car. Chris played his flashlight over the interior and saw nothing unusual. Empty coffee cups in the holder, a field guide to North American bats on the passenger seat, a sleeping bag and camping equipment visible through the rear window. He checked the doors, locked, and noted the lack of snow on the windshield. She'd been here at least 2 days, probably longer. The overnight temperatures would have caused any accumulated snow to sublimate, but there should have been some frost pattern if the car had been here through the previous night's freeze. The glass was too clean. That meant she'd parked here sometime during the warmer afternoon hours, probably 3 days ago. Chris pulled out his incident report form and started documenting. Time of arrival, 6:02 a.m. Weather conditions, overcast, temperature 23 degrees, wind from the northwest at 10 to 15 mph. Subject's vehicle located and secured. Beginning trail search at 6:15 a.m. The Grinnell Glacier Trail started as a well-maintained path through lodgepole pine forest, but Chris knew it would deteriorate rapidly as he gained elevation. The early snow had turned the trail to frozen mud interspersed with patches of ice, treacherous in the dim light of dawn. He moved carefully, his breath clouding in front of his face, his boots crunching through the thin crust of frozen precipitation. 40 minutes in, he found the first sign. A small plastic flag tied to a tree branch, the kind researchers used to mark their route. Definitely Rachel's. The flag was bright orange, highly visible, exactly what a competent researcher would use to ensure she could find her way back. Chris marked the location on his GPS and continued. The second flag appeared 20 minutes later, and the third after another half hour of climbing. Each one was exactly where it should be, spaced at regular intervals, clearly marking a route toward the cave system. Rachel had been following proper protocol. No signs of panic or disorientation. So what had gone wrong? The forest began to thin as Chris climbed above 6,000 feet. Here the trees were twisted and stunted by wind and winter, their branches reaching toward the pale sky like arthritic fingers. Granite outcroppings broke through the soil, dark stone veined with quartz that glittered in the growing light. And between the rocks, Chris could see the first opening, a low, dark mouth in the limestone, barely 3 feet high, half hidden by twisted juniper. He found Rachel's base camp 30 yards from the cave entrance. The tent was still standing, a bright blue dome that stood out against the browns and grays of the landscape. But something about it was wrong. Chris approached slowly, every sense heightened, though he couldn't have said what triggered his caution. The tent's zipper was closed. No wind damage, no animal interference, but the silence around it felt deliberate, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. "Rachel Hoffman, Park Service." His voice echoed off the rocks and died. No response. Chris circled the tent, looking for tracks for any sign of recent activity. The ground was frozen hard, making it difficult to read, but he could see the faint depressions where Rachel had walked between the tent and the cave entrance. Multiple trips, judging by the overlapping patterns. All of them heading into the cave, none coming out. He unzipped the tent and looked inside. Sleeping bag neatly rolled, camping stove and food supplies organized in stuff sacks. A laptop computer, expensive equipment for fieldwork, sitting on top of a closed journal. Everything meticulously maintained, exactly what he'd expect from a researcher described as meticulous about safety protocols. Except for the smell. It was faint, barely noticeable beneath the musty odor of tent fabric and the clean scent of pine. But Chris's nostrils flared when he caught it. Something organic, something that reminded him of the walk-in cooler at the butcher shop in Kalispell, where his father used to take him as a child. The smell of meat kept just slightly too long, beginning that first subtle transition from fresh to questionable. Chris backed out of the tent and pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Brennan. I've located the subject's base camp at approximately 6,400 feet. Coordinates." He read off the GPS numbers. Camp appears intact. No immediate signs of the subject. I'm preparing to investigate the cave system. Be advised, cell coverage is non-existent up here. Radio range is marginal. Copy that, Brennan. How do you want to proceed? I'm going in. If you don't hear from me in 6 hours, send backup. Chris checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. Expect my next contact no later than 1500 hours. Roger. Be safe out there. Chris signed off and stood looking at the cave entrance. The opening was low and narrow, requiring him to crouch, but he could see from the scratches in the limestone that Rachel had widened it slightly, probably to accommodate her equipment. Smart, professional, someone who thought ahead, who prepared for contingencies. Someone like Marcus. He shook his head again, harder this time. Focus. Present moment. Rachel Hoffman, 28 years old, missing for approximately 72 hours now, last known location in these caves. Temperature outside was rising to maybe 30 degrees, but inside those limestone chambers, it would be a constant 45 to 50 degrees year-round. Cold enough for hypothermia if she was injured and immobile, but not immediately fatal. There was still a chance. Chris clicked on his headlamp, a Petzeltika XP, 60 lumens, the brightest he owned, and pulled out his backup flashlight. He tested both lights, checking the beams. Then he ducked his head and entered the cave. The passage was tight for the first 20 feet, forcing him to move in an awkward crouch, his pack scraping against the low ceiling. But then it opened into a larger chamber, perhaps 15 feet across and twice that in height. Chris straightened, playing his light across the walls, and froze. The chamber was covered in scratches, not natural erosion patterns, not the random marks of geological time. These were deliberate, carved with something sharp, repeated in patterns that covered every available surface. Some looked recent, the exposed limestone still pale. Others were older, darkened with age, possibly decades old. And among them, scratched deep enough to leave grooves Chris could feel with his fingers, were symbols. They looked like letters, maybe, from some alphabet Chris didn't recognize. Angular, harsh, all straight lines and sharp corners, and between the symbols, scratched over and over and over, was a shape that Chris did recognize even though he'd never seen it before. A crude cross, but wrong somehow, with extra horizontal bars at odd angles, and something like a crescent moon beneath it. The protective signs Pete Moldovan's grandfather had drawn. Chris felt his pulse hammering in his throat. This was just folklore. Immigrant superstition. These markings probably dated back to the mining days, when the Eastern European workers had dug exploratory shafts in the area. They'd brought their old beliefs with them, their protections against things that went bump in the night. It meant nothing. It was just cultural history, anthropological interest, not... A sound echoed from deeper in the cave system. A scraping, like something heavy being dragged across stone. Rachel! Chris's voice cracked on the name. He cleared his throat and tried again. Rachel Hoffman, can you hear me? It's the Park Service. The scraping stopped. In the sudden silence, Chris became aware of his own breathing, harsh and too fast. He forced himself to slow it, to think like a professional. If Rachel was injured and delirious, she might not respond to his calls. She might be unconscious. He needed to search systematically, to map the cave system as he went, to make sure he could find his way back out. The chamber had 3 exits. The passage he'd come through and 2 others. One led upward at a slight angle, the walls narrowing. The other descended, a steeper shaft that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of his headlamp. The bats would be in the lower chambers where temperature and humidity were most stable. That's where a researcher would go. That's where Rachel would have gone. Chris approached the descending passage and paused at the edge. The smell was stronger here, not overwhelming, but definitely present. That same organic meat cooler odor with something else beneath it now. Something that reminded him of the rendering plant outside Missoula, where they processed animal carcasses into bone meal and tallow. His radio crackled with static, then died. Too deep, too much rock between him and the relay towers. He was on his own now. Chris checked his gear one more time. Rope secured, knife accessible, first aid kit easy to reach, and started down into the darkness. The passage was steep enough to require both hands, a scrambling descent over breakdown and flowstone. His headlamp beam bounced crazily as he moved, throwing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist in the periphery of his vision. The smell grew stronger. And underneath it, almost subliminal, Chris thought he heard something. Not the scraping from before. This was different. Softer. almost like breathing, but with a wet, labored quality that made the skin on the back of his neck prickle. The passage opened into another chamber, this one larger than the first. Chris's light couldn't reach the ceiling, disappearing into blackness above. The walls glistened with moisture, and he could hear the steady drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. And there, in the center of the chamber, was Rachel's equipment. A field pack, overturned, a digital camera, the lens shattered, notebooks scattered across the cave floor, their pages dark with moisture, a mist net, tangled and torn, and everywhere, covering everything, was a dark substance that Chris's rational mind tried to identify as mud or mineral deposits, but that his hindbrain knew, immediately and certainly, was dried blood. Chris moved forward slowly, his light sweeping the scene. So much blood. Too much for Rachel to have lost and survived. It pooled in the depressions of the limestone floor, splattered across the walls in arterial spray patterns, and in the blood were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled through it, pulled deeper into the cave system. His hands were shaking now. He didn't try to stop them. "Rachel," he whispered, but he knew she wouldn't answer. Nobody could lose this much blood and answer. A voice spoke from the darkness behind him. She screamed for a long time. Chris spun, his light sweeping across the chamber, and found nothing. Empty limestone, glistening walls, shadows that pressed against the edges of his vision but revealed nothing when he turned toward them directly. "Who's there?" His voice sounded thin, reedy, embarrassing. He was a Park Service ranger. He'd been trained for wilderness emergencies, for medical trauma, for every natural hazard the backcountry could throw at him. He wasn't trained for voices in the dark, for blood-soaked caves, for symbols scratched in stone. "She called your name," the voice continued. It came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to echo from multiple directions at once. The accent was wrong, each word carefully enunciated in a way that suggested English was not the speaker's first language. She said, "Where is the ranger? Where is Christopher Brennan? I told her you weren't coming. I told her you'd stopped coming to caves 8 years ago after you let your friend die." The cold that went through Chris had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. "How do you know my name?" "I know all their names. Marcus Chen, Rachel Hoffman, and before them, so many others. The miners who first found these caves in 1907, the foolish priest who tried to bless them in 1923, the 3 children who went exploring in 1956 and were never seen again. I have tasted all their fear, drunk all their screaming." A pause, and then, almost conversationally, "You taste different, Christopher. Your fear is old, fermented, rich." Chris's hand found his knife, though he knew even as he drew it that steel wouldn't help him here. "Where's Rachel? What did you do to her?" "What I always do. What my kind has done since we crawled from the burial grounds of the Carpathians and found new hunting grounds in this new world. We feed, we hunger. We take what's warm and make it cold." The voice shifted, coming from a different direction now, behind and above. "But Rachel fought. She injured me with her light, burned my skin with her silver batteries, so I took my time with her. I wanted her to understand what was happening, to feel every moment as I drained her." Something moved in the darkness above Chris's head. Not a sound exactly, but a displacement of air, a sense of mass shifting. He brought his light up and saw it. The thing clinging to the cave ceiling should have been impossible. It was vaguely human-shaped but elongated, emaciated, its limbs too long and jointed wrong. The skin was corpse pale where it wasn't covered in dark stains, stretched tight over prominent bones. But the face, God, the face was the worst part. It had been human once. Male, Chris thought, with features that suggested Eastern European ancestry. But the eyes were all wrong, too large, reflective like an animal's, catching his light and throwing it back in shades of red and amber. And the mouth, stretched impossibly wide, revealed teeth that had been filed or broken into points, stained dark with old blood. It smiled at him. "Hello, Christopher. I've been waiting for you." Ever since I took Marcus, I've been wondering when you'd finally gather the courage to come back into the deep places. When you'd stop running from what you saw that day." The creature's voice was the same one from the darkness, but hearing it come from that mouth, seeing the lips form the words, made it infinitely worse. "You knew, didn't you? Even then, you knew something was wrong. Something was hunting. But you stopped, and Marcus kept going, and I was so very hungry that day." Chris's training finally kicked in, the adrenaline burning through the paralysis of fear. He backed toward the passage entrance, keeping his light trained on the creature. His knife held in a grip he knew was inadequate, but couldn't bring himself to lower. "You're not real. You're stress, hallucination, maybe a bear. There are black bears in these caves. They hibernate." "Bears." The thing laughed, a sound like stones grinding together. "Yes, that's what they always say. Bears, or mountain lions, or accidents. Never the truth, never the strigoi." It released its grip on the ceiling and dropped to the cave floor with a wet thud, landing in a crouch that suggested infinite patience. "We came over in the ships, you know, hidden in cargo, sleeping in the deep holds. The old country became too dangerous for us. Too many who knew how to kill us, too many churches with priests who remembered the old rites. But here, this fresh new world, so much wilderness, so many deep places to hide. And the immigrants brought us food, brought us warm blood in vessels that spoke our language and believed in our power." Chris's back hit the passage wall, 20 feet to the exit, 20 feet through which he'd have to turn his back on this thing. "What happened to Rachel?" "She's resting, or rather, what's left of her is resting." The strigoi tilted its head, the gesture somehow more disturbing than anything it had said. "I couldn't turn her, if that's what you're asking. The transformation requires intent, requires that I stop before the heart ceases. But I was so hungry, Christopher. A century of feeding on bats and cave rats and the occasional stupid hiker. All those years of carefully hiding, of taking only what wouldn't be noticed. And then she came, with her lights and her silver batteries and her blood so hot and fresh and full of life. I couldn't stop. I drank until there was nothing left to drink." It took a step forward. Chris noticed it was naked, its body a horror of protruding ribs and distended joints, its movements both fluid and wrong, as if the joints bent in directions human anatomy shouldn't allow. "But you," the strigoi continued, taking another step, "you would make a fine vessel, strong, healthy, familiar with these mountains, able to guide others here to bring me more food. The transformation is painful, but brief. And afterward," its smile widened. "Afterward, you'll understand. You'll feel the hunger, the glorious endless hunger. You'll hunt with me in the darkness and we'll feed together, and you'll never again have to feel the guilt of letting someone die, because you'll be the one doing the killing." Chris ran. He scrambled up the passage, his hands scrabbling on wet limestone, his pack catching on outcroppings. Behind him he heard the strigoi laugh again, heard its feet slapping on stone as it followed. But it wasn't hurrying. It knew these caves. It had all the time in the world. Chris burst into the first chamber, the one covered in protective symbols, and for a moment he felt a surge of hope. This was where the miners had carved their protections, their warnings. Maybe the symbols actually worked. Maybe the creature couldn't. It flowed up through the passage behind him without hesitation, moving across the symbol-covered walls, without even seeming to notice them. "Oh, Christopher, did you think carved stone would stop me? Those marks are old. Their power long faded. The men who made them believed, truly believed, and that gave their work strength. But belief dies, Christopher. It always dies. And with it, protection." Chris fled toward the exit, the narrow passage that led back to daylight. He could see the opening ahead, could see the gray morning light that meant safety, meant open air and sunshine. The strigoi couldn't follow into daylight. The folklore was clear about that, at least. Get outside, get into the sun, call for backup, come back with what? Silver bullets? Wooden stakes? Holy water? He was a Park Service ranger, not a vampire hunter. He had a knife and a radio and training in wilderness first aid. none of which would help against something that should not exist, that could not exist, that was nevertheless reaching for him with hands that ended in claws blackened with old blood. The hand caught the back of his pack, jerking him backward. Chris twisted, slashing wildly with his knife, feeling the blade connect with something that parted like rotten meat. The strigoi hissed, releasing him, and Chris saw dark fluid, not quite blood, too thick, too cold, welling from the cut on its arm. "Silver," it snarled. "You carry silver." It looked at the knife in Chris's hand with something that might have been respect. The blade is steel, but the rivets in the handle, argentium. Enough to burn. Clever, Christopher. Or perhaps just lucky. Chris didn't waste time answering. He lunged for the exit, squeezing through the narrow opening, feeling his jacket tear on the rough limestone. He could smell the outside air now, cold and clean and free of the charnel reek that filled the caves. Just a few more feet. Just a little further. He tumbled out into the morning light and immediately scrambled away from the cave entrance, putting distance between himself and the darkness. The sun had risen higher while he was underground, and the temperature had climbed to maybe 35 degrees. Still cold, but gloriously, wonderfully warm compared to the cave. Chris's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a long moment, nothing happened. The cave entrance remained dark and silent. Maybe it couldn't come out. Maybe. A hand shot out of the opening, pale and skeletal, its skin blistering and smoking where the indirect sunlight touched it. The Strigoi's voice echoed from the darkness. "I can't follow, not yet. The sun is too strong, too direct. But it will set, Christopher. In 8 hours it will set. And when the shadows grow long enough, I'll come for you. I'll hunt you across these mountains. I'll find you wherever you run." A pause, and then softer. "Or you could come back inside. End this quickly. Let me give you the gift of immortality, of endless hunger, satisfied by endless hunting. You'd be magnificent, Christopher. An apex predator finally embracing your true nature." Chris backed away until he could no longer see the cave entrance, until he was sure he was out of reach even if the creature could somehow extend itself into the light. Then he collapsed against a rock outcropping, his whole body shaking. Marcus. 8 years ago. The shadow he'd seen moving against the granite walls of Avalanche Gorge, the way Marcus's voice had cut off mid-sentence. He'd assumed it was a fall, equipment failure, some natural explanation. But it hadn't been natural at all. It had been this thing, this Strigoi, hunting in caves throughout Glacier National Park, taking victims carefully, sparingly, hiding the evidence. And the one time Chris's instincts had screamed at him to stop, to not follow Marcus around that corner, he'd listened, he'd lived, and Marcus had died. Chris pulled out his radio with trembling hands. Still no signal, too much rock between him and the relay towers, even here outside the cave. He'd have to descend at least 1,000 feet, get down below the granite ridge before he could call for help. Help. What kind of help? What was he going to tell dispatch? That a vampire was living in the limestone caves off Grinnell Glacier Trail? That Rachel Hoffman had been exsanguinated by something that should exist only in folklore? They'd think he'd gone hypothermic, delirious. They'd send up a rescue team to extract him, and by the time they arrived, the sun would be setting and the Strigoi would what? Hunt them all? Kill everyone who came into these mountains? Chris thought of the protective symbols carved into the cave walls, thought of Pete Moldovan's grandfather drawing them with shaking hands. The old immigrant miners had known. They'd encountered the Strigoi in these caves almost a century ago, had tried to warn future generations, but nobody had believed. The symbols had remained, but their meaning had been lost, dismissed as superstition. Until now. Chris forced himself to his feet. He had maybe 8 hours until sunset. 8 hours to get down the mountain to convince someone, anyone, that the threat was real. 8 hours to find whatever weapons or protections might work against something that shouldn't exist. But first, he had to get Rachel's body. He couldn't leave her in there, couldn't let her rot in the darkness while that thing... No, that was tactical stupidity, emotional thinking overriding logic. Rachel was dead, had been dead for days. Recovering her remains was important, but not as important as stopping the Strigoi before it could kill again. He needed to prioritize, to think like a professional. He needed to think like Marcus would have thought. The realization hit him hard enough to make him stagger. For 8 years he'd been trying not to think like Marcus, trying to distance himself from his partner's fate. He'd avoided the deep caves, the technical searches, anything that might put him in a similar situation. He'd let guilt and fear dictate his choices, had let Marcus's death paralyze him. No more. Chris checked his watch. 9:34 a.m. The sun would set at approximately 6:15 p.m. That gave him 8 hours and 41 minutes to become a vampire hunter. He started down the trail at a controlled run, his boots skidding on patches of ice, his mind racing faster than his feet. What did he know about Strigoi? What had Pete Moldovan said? Wooden stakes, ash wood specifically, garlic, silver, sunlight, decapitation and burning the body. All of it folk wisdom, but the silver had worked. His knife had hurt it. That meant the folklore might contain real tactical information, methods that had been tested and proven over centuries of human experience with these creatures. His radio crackled to life at 10:17 a.m. as he descended below 5,000 feet. Brennan, do you copy? Brennan, this is dispatch. Your check-in time has passed. Please respond. Chris grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Brennan. I copy. He took a breath, trying to steady his voice. I've located the subject. She's deceased. I need immediate assistance. Copy that, Brennan. We'll get a recovery team mobilized. What's the situation? What was the situation? How could he possibly explain? Chris closed his eyes, thinking fast. Dispatch, I need you to contact Pete Moldovan in Columbia Falls, the man who called about the cave folklore. Tell him we found evidence of what his grandfather warned about. Tell him we need his help. We need... Chris paused, knowing how insane this would sound. We need ashwood stakes, blessed if possible. We need silver. We need someone who knows the old protections. Silence on the radio. Then, Brennan, are you injured? Do you need medical evacuation? Negative. I'm not injured. But I'm not delirious either. Whatever's in those caves killed Rachel Hoffman and it killed Marcus Chen 8 years ago. It's real and it's extremely dangerous. And it will come out when the sun sets. We have maybe 7 hours to prepare. Brennan. I know how it sounds, but I saw it. I have blood evidence. I have witness testimony. Chris was shouting now, his voice echoing off the rocks. Contact Moldovan, get whatever he recommends, and send backup, but tell them not to approach the caves until I get down there. Tell them to stay in direct sunlight. Tell them... He stopped, realizing he was spiraling, that panic was beginning to override training. He forced himself to breathe. Just trust me, please. Contact Moldovan. I'll be at the trailhead in 90 minutes. Another long pause, then... Copy. I'll make the call. But Brennan, when you get down here, you're going straight to medical. Understood? Understood. Brennan out. He ran faster, sliding down switchbacks, using his hands when the terrain became too steep. His pack bounced against his back, equipment jangling. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself at the last second. But he kept moving, driven by the image of that thing clinging to the cave ceiling, by the memory of its voice promising to hunt him after dark. The trailhead appeared below at 11:52 a.m. Chris could see 2 Park Service vehicles in the lot now, along with a Sheriff's Department cruiser. 3 rangers stood by the trucks, and an old man in a canvas jacket was gesturing emphatically, his white hair bright in the midday sun. Pete Moldovan. Chris staggered into the parking lot and was immediately surrounded by concerned faces. Someone thrust a water bottle into his hands. Someone else was taking his pack, checking him for injuries. He heard voices asking questions, expressing concern, suggesting that he should sit down, that he looked like hell, that they should call a medical helicopter. No, Chris managed. No time. The sun sets at 6:15. We need to be ready. Pete Moldovan pushed through the crowd. He was smaller than Chris expected, maybe 5'6" and thin as a willow branch, but his eyes were sharp and knowing. You saw it, he said, Not a question. Yes. Describe. Chris did in short, efficient sentences. The cave, the blood, the creature's appearance and abilities, the silver burning its skin. Pete nodded throughout, his expression growing grimmer. Strigoi, he confirmed. My grandfather called them moroi sometimes. The undead who hunger. He said there were 3 in the caves when the miners first found them in 1907. The miners killed 2 with stakes and fire. The 3rd escaped deeper into the mountain. They thought it had fled, or died, or... He shrugged. My grandfather drew the protective symbols on every wall he could reach. He wanted to seal the caves, but the mining company wouldn't allow it. There was copper in these mountains, money to be made. How do we kill it? Ash wood stake through the heart, decapitation with a blessed blade, burning the body until nothing remains. Pete reached into his jacket and pulled out a wooden stake, its tip sharpened to a wicked point. The wood was dark with age but had been recently oiled, maintained. My grandfather made these in 1909, made 6 of them, used 4 on the Strigoi they killed. I have the last 2. Chris took the stake, feeling its weight. It was surprisingly heavy, the wood dense and hard. Is it enough? If you get close enough to use it, yes. Pete's expression was sympathetic. But Strigoi are fast, Christopher. Stronger than humans. Intelligent. They've survived for centuries by being careful, by being clever. It won't be easy to get within striking distance. One of the other rangers, a young woman named Sarah Chen, Marcus's niece, Chris realized with a jolt, spoke up. What about fire? Could we trap it in the cave and burn it out? Pete shook his head. The cave system is too deep, too complex. It would retreat to the deepest chambers and wait. Strigoi can go months without feeding if necessary, and if we seal the entrance, it will eventually dig out. No, it has to be confronted directly. It has to be destroyed completely. Then we go in after dark, Chris said. With lights, with stakes, with silver. We go in, and we finish this. You're serious? The sheriff's deputy, a barrel-chested man named Williams, stared at him incredulously. You want to take a search party into unstable caves after dark to hunt something that probably doesn't exist based on 100-year-old folklore? It killed Rachel Hoffman. Chris met his eyes steadily. And it killed Marcus Chen 8 years ago, and probably a dozen others before them. Yes, I'm serious. This is insane. Maybe. But Rachel's blood is all over that cave. The evidence is there, and that thing told me it would come out after sunset to hunt. If we don't stop it tonight, how many others will it kill? How long before it decides to expand its territory, to go after hikers on the main trails? Williams looked like he wanted to argue further, but Pete intervened. I will go with him, the old man said quietly. My grandfather would expect it. My family has owed this debt for a century. Let us pay it. Sarah Chen stepped forward. I'll go too. For my uncle. Others volunteered. 3 more rangers, 2 deputies, Pete's grandson Daniel, who was built like a linebacker, and had brought his hunting rifle just in case. By the time they were finished planning, Chris had a team of 9, all equipped with high-powered flashlights, spare batteries, and whatever improvised weapons they could gather. Daniel had brought not only his rifle but also 2 hunting bows, arguing that wooden arrows tipped with silver could serve as stakes if necessary. One of the rangers had blessed water from the Catholic Church in Kalispell. Another had produced a bottle of something that smelled like gasoline and garlic mixed together, which Pete identified as palinka, a plum brandy that his grandfather had considered essential for fighting Strigoi. They hate the smell of fermentation, Pete explained. Reminds them of the decay they're trying to avoid. Pour it on them and they'll recoil. But, he added, it's also highly flammable, so if you use it, be careful with your lights. They spent the afternoon preparing, checking equipment, going over the cave layout that Chris had hastily sketched. The plan was simple, perhaps too simple. Enter as a group, move through the cave system to the chamber where Chris had encountered the Strigoi, and confront it directly. Use lights to disorient it, silver to wound it, and ash stakes to kill it. If possible, decapitate and burn the body to ensure it couldn't regenerate. It was, Chris reflected, possibly the stupidest plan he'd ever been part of. But it was also the only plan they had. The sun began to set at 6:03 p.m., earlier than predicted due to cloud cover moving in from the west. By 6:45, full darkness had fallen over the mountains. The team assembled at the cave entrance, their lights creating a pool of illumination against the surrounding darkness. Chris took point, Pete beside him carrying both remaining ash stakes. Sarah Chen was third in line, her uncle's old service pistol loaded with bullets that Daniel had painstakingly exposed to silver nitrate solution. Behind them, the rest of the team spread out, maintaining visual contact, but giving themselves room to maneuver. The cave entrance seemed darker than Chris remembered, the shadows deeper and more solid. He could feel the temperature drop as they entered, could smell that charnel reek wafting up from below. But this time, he wasn't alone. This time he had backup, weapons, a plan. This time they were the hunters. They moved through the first chamber, the one covered in protective symbols. Pete stopped to touch several of them, murmuring words in a language Chris didn't understand. Romanian, maybe, or some older dialect. The symbols seemed to glow faintly in their lights, but that might have been tricks of shadow and wishful thinking. The descent passage was just as treacherous as Chris remembered. They moved carefully, checking each handhold, each footstep. Someone behind Chris slipped, caught themselves with a muttered curse. The sound echoed down into the depths, announcing their presence. Not that stealth mattered. The Strigoi knew they were coming. The blood-soaked chamber was exactly as Chris had left it, Rachel's equipment still scattered across the floor. Sarah Chen made a small sound when she saw the amount of blood, and Chris heard her whisper something that might have been a prayer. But the chamber was empty. No creature clung to the ceiling. No voice spoke from the darkness. "Where is it?" Williams asked, his voice too loud in the enclosed space. "Deeper," Pete said. "It's gone to the oldest part of the cave, where the darkness is absolute, where it feels strongest." They found the passage in the back wall, a vertical shaft that dropped into darkness beyond the reach of their lights. Chris aimed his beam downward and saw the bottom, perhaps 25 feet below. And at the bottom, scratch marks. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Every surface covered in the same angular symbols, the same protective crosses, as if someone had spent years down there doing nothing but carving warnings. "My grandfather did that," Pete said quietly. "After they killed the other two Strigoi, he went down to check if the third one was hiding there. It was. It attacked him. He barely escaped with his life, but he sealed every inch of that chamber with protections before he left. He said..." Pete's voice wavered slightly. "He said he could feel it below him the whole time he was carving. Waiting. Watching. Hungry. Will the symbols hold it? They did for 100 years. But I suspect it's been testing them slowly, patiently, finding the weak points. Otherwise it wouldn't have risked coming up to the higher chambers to feed on Rachel." Chris attached his rope to a secure anchor point and prepared to descend. "Stay here," he told the others. "Cover the opening. If I don't come back up in 10 minutes..." "We're not waiting 10 minutes," Sarah interrupted. "Either we all go, or none of us go. Uncle Marcus went alone. Look how that turned out." She was right. Chris knew she was right. But the thought of leading these people into that darkness, of being responsible if something went wrong. "Together," Pete said firmly. "We end this together." They descended one by one, Chris first, then Pete, then the others. The shaft was tight, claustrophobic, its walls pressing in from all sides. Chris's light showed more symbols covering every surface, some carved so deeply the stone had cracked. Whatever power they'd once held, it was fading now. Several of the crosses had been scratched over, defaced, their protection compromised. The bottom chamber was larger than Chris expected, perhaps 50 feet across, and it was filled with bones, human bones, animal bones. Bones picked clean and stacked in careful arrangements, sorted by size and type. Skulls formed pyramids in the corners. Femurs and tibias were arranged in radial patterns like some grotesque mandala, and in the center of it all, sitting on a throne made of rib cages and vertebrae, was the strigoi. It smiled at them with Rachel's blood still staining its teeth. "Welcome," it said. "I've been preparing for guests." 9 lights focused on it simultaneously, and the creature hissed, raising one skeletal arm to shield its eyes. But it didn't retreat. Instead, it laughed, that same grinding stone sound Chris had heard before. "Light. How quaint. Did you think brightness alone would stop me? I've lived in these caves for 116 years. I've learned to tolerate discomfort when necessary." It lowered its arm slowly, deliberately, its reflective eyes adjusting to the glare. "Besides, your batteries will die eventually, and I can wait forever." "Not this time," Pete said. He held up one of the ash stakes, his hand steady despite his age. "This ends tonight, beast, one way or another." The Strigoi's smile widened. "Ah, Moldovan. Yes, I know your scent. I could smell it in your grandfather, that mixture of fear and determination. I almost took him, you know. That day when he came down here alone to carve his pitiful symbols. I was right behind him, close enough to touch. But I was curious. I wanted to see what he would do, what protections he thought would hold me. So I waited and watched, and he carved and prayed, and when he was finished he ran up that shaft faster than any human should be able to climb." The creature's expression became almost nostalgic. "I kept one of his tools, a chisel. I've used it to deface the symbols one by one, year by year. Eventually they'll all be gone, and then I'll be free to hunt wherever I wish." "Enough talking," Williams said. He raised his shotgun and fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, a concussive wave that made Chris's ears ring. The buckshot caught the strigoi in the chest, tearing through its desiccated flesh, spraying dark ichor across the bone throne. The creature looked down at the wound with something like curiosity. Then it looked back up at Williams and laughed. "Guns. Of course you brought guns. Did your folklore not mention that I'm already dead? You cannot kill what does not live." It stood, bones clattering as it rose to its full height, 7 feet perhaps, its spine elongated unnaturally. "But thank you for demonstrating your weakness. Now allow me to demonstrate my strength." It moved. Chris had seen mountain lions hunting, had watched grizzly bears charge at close range. The strigoi was faster. One moment it was on the throne, the next it was across the chamber, its clawed hand wrapped around Williams's throat. The deputy had time for one choked gasp before the creature's fingers tightened, and Chris heard the wet crack of cartilage collapsing. Then everything happened at once. Daniel fired an arrow, the wooden shaft whistling through the air. It caught the strigoi in the shoulder, driving deep, and the creature shrieked, actually shrieked a sound of genuine pain. It released Williams, who collapsed gasping, and turned toward Daniel with murder in its reflective eyes. Sarah fired her pistol, the silver-treated bullets punching into the strigoi's torso. Each impact made it stagger, made dark fluid spray from the wounds. Not blood exactly, but something close. Something that smoked where it touched the limestone floor. Pete charged forward with the ash stake raised, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. The strigoi saw him coming and backhanded him casually, contemptuously. Pete flew backward, crashed into the wall, and slumped down with his stake rolling away across the floor. Chris dove for the stake, his fingers closing around the aged wood. The strigoi turned toward him, and for a moment their eyes met. In those reflective depths, Chris saw centuries of hunger, of endless feeding, of contempt for the brief candle flicker of human life. He saw Marcus's last moments. He saw Rachel screaming in the darkness. He saw himself 8 years ago, stopping at the edge of the gorge while his partner walked forward into death. Not this time. Chris lunged forward, driving the stake toward the creature's chest. The strigoi twisted, impossibly fast, and the point scraped across its ribs instead of piercing its heart. But ash wood burned it more than silver bullets, more than light. Where the stake touched, flesh blackened and smoked. The strigoi howled and lashed out, its claws raking across Chris's shoulder, cutting through jacket and shirt and skin. Pain exploded through Chris's arm, hot and immediate. He stumbled backward, nearly losing his grip on the stake. Blood, his blood, human blood still warm, poured down his sleeve. The Strigoi paused, nostrils flaring. It looked at the blood, then at Chris, and its expression became almost reverent. "Oh," it breathed. "Oh, you smell magnificent. Such terror, such guilt, such delicious complexity." It took a step closer, ignoring the others, ignoring the lights and guns and arrows. "I'll turn you, Christopher. Not kill you. I'll make you like me. You'll hunt in these mountains for centuries. You'll taste fear the way I taste it. We'll drink life the way I drink it. You'll..." Pete's grandson Daniel hit it from behind with an aluminum baseball bat wrapped in silver wire. The impact drove the creature forward into Chris's waiting stake. This time, Chris's aim was true. The ashwood penetrated between the fourth and fifth ribs, angled upward, and punched through into the dead heart beyond. The Strigoi stopped mid-word, its mouth still open, its eyes wide with something that might have been surprise. It looked down at the stake protruding from its chest, touched it gently with one clawed hand. When it spoke again, its voice was different, quieter, almost human. "My name," it said, "was Grigor Popescu. I died in Transylvania in 1891. They buried me in unhallowed ground because I was a murderer and a thief, and I woke in the earth, and I clawed my way up through 6 feet of soil, and I fed on my family first because they were closest." The creature, Grigor, looked at Chris, and for a moment its eyes were just eyes, human and lost. "I don't remember what it was like to be warm, to be alive, to be anything except hungry." Then the humanity fled, and the monster returned. It grabbed the stake with both hands and began to pull, its strength phenomenal even with ash wood through its heart. "But I won't go back to the earth, I won't." Sarah Chen fired 3 more silver bullets into its head. The creature's skull exploded, spraying the walls with that dark, smoking fluid. Its body convulsed, hands releasing the stake, limbs flailing wildly. It collapsed backward onto its throne of bones, and the bones scattered, ribs and skulls rolling across the cave floor. For a long moment, nobody moved. They stood in the flickering light of their flashlights, breathing hard, watching the twitching body. Chris's shoulder burned where he'd been clawed, his arm hanging useless at his side. Williams was clutching his throat, gasping wetly. Pete was conscious but dazed, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "Is it dead?" someone asked. "No," Pete said hoarsely. He pushed himself upright, retrieving the second ash stake. "Not until we complete the ritual. Not until..." The Strigoi's hand shot out and grabbed Pete's ankle. It was moving without its head, pulled by whatever dark animation powered it. Its remaining hand crawled up Pete's leg, seeking purchase, seeking to pull him down to its level where it could... What? Bite him with a mouth that no longer existed? Drain him with a throat that had been destroyed? Pete brought the second stake down with all his strength, driving it through the creature's wrist and into the limestone floor, pinning it in place. The hand spasmed once, twice, then went still. "Fire," Pete said. "We need fire. Now." They had come prepared. Daniel produced a military-grade incendiary grenade, the kind used for controlled burns. "Will this work?" "It'll have to." They soaked the body in Pete's grandfather's palinka, the fermented plum brandy creating a puddle around the bones and the corpse. The smell was overwhelming, sweet and harsh simultaneously. Then Daniel pulled the pin and dropped the grenade. "Go!" Chris shouted. "Everyone up now!" They scrambled for the vertical shaft, climbing with desperate haste. Behind them, Chris heard the grenade detonate, heard the whoosh of flames catching. He looked back once and saw the entire chamber engulfed in fire, the bones burning, the body of Grigor Popescu blackening and curling in the heat. And he saw, just for a moment, something rise from the flames. Not physical, not corporeal, but a shape, a silhouette that might have been human once, reaching upward as if trying to escape, as if begging for release. Then it was gone, and there was only fire. They emerged from the caves at 9:37 p.m., staggering into the cold October night. Chris's shoulder was bleeding badly now, soaking through the makeshift bandage Sarah had applied. Williams needed immediate medical attention for his crushed larynx. Pete had a probable concussion. Daniel had second-degree burns on his hands from the heat of the flames that had chased them up the shaft. But they were alive. Ambulances were waiting at the trailhead, summoned by the rangers who'd remained above. Paramedics swarmed them, assessing injuries, applying dressings, preparing transport. Chris submitted to their ministrations numbly, barely feeling the sting of antiseptic or the tightness of proper bandages. A helicopter evacuated Williams and Pete to the hospital in Kalispell. The rest of them were treated on site and released with instructions to follow up with their doctors. As the medical teams packed up their equipment, one of the senior rangers approached Chris. "What the hell happened down there?" Chris looked at Sarah Chen, at Daniel, at the other team members. They looked back at him, a silent consensus forming. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud, too impossible for official reports. "Cave collapse," Chris said finally. "Unstable limestone. We found evidence that Rachel Hoffman had been killed by falling rock. We attempted to recover the body but triggered a secondary collapse. We were forced to retreat. The entire chamber system is now unstable and should be sealed immediately." The senior ranger studied his face for a long moment. Then, "And that's your official statement?" "Yes, sir." "You're sure?" Chris thought of Grigore Popescu, of a man who died in 1891 and woken up hungry. He thought of Rachel Hoffman, her blood painting the walls of a cave that should have been sealed a century ago. He thought of Marcus Chen, disappearing around a granite outcropping with a shadow that moved wrong following behind him. "I'm sure." The official report, filed 3 days later, listed Rachel Hoffman's death as accidental, caused by a fall during cave exploration. It recommended immediate closure of the limestone cave system off Grinnell Glacier Trail due to extreme structural instability. The recommendation was approved. By the end of November, the cave entrance had been blasted shut and sealed with concrete, with warning signs posted at multiple points along the trail. Chris spent 2 weeks on medical leave, his shoulder healing slowly. The claws had cut deep, missing major arteries by millimeters. The doctors said he was lucky. Chris didn't feel lucky. He felt tired and old, and haunted by dreams of reflective eyes in the darkness. On the 13th day of his leave, Pete Moldovan visited him at his cabin. The old man looked diminished, smaller somehow, his head wrapped in bandages. But his eyes were clear, and he carried a wooden box under one arm. "My grandfather's legacy," Pete said, setting the box on Chris's kitchen table. "I think you should have it." Inside were journals, written in Romanian and English, detailing every encounter with the Strigoi from 1907 onward. There were drawings of protective symbols, recipes for blessed water and silver-infused weapons, instructions for identifying and destroying different types of undead. And at the bottom, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, was a photograph. 6 men stood in front of a mine shaft, their faces serious, their clothes stained with soot and blood. One of them held an ashwood stake. Another displayed what looked like a severed head, pale and inhuman, its mouth open in a frozen scream. "Proof," Pete said quietly, "that they killed 2, that they fought the 3rd and sealed it below ground. My grandfather kept this hidden all his life. He was afraid of what would happen if people knew the truth, afraid they'd think him crazy. But he wanted the knowledge preserved in case—" He gestured at the journals. "In case the last one ever got free." "It did get free," Chris said. "It killed Rachel. It killed Marcus. Probably killed others we don't know about. And you stopped it. You and your team. The debt is paid." Pete stood to leave, then paused at the door. "My grandfather used to say that evil doesn't die, Christopher. It just sleeps, and sometimes it wakes up hungry. If you ever need help, if you ever encounter something else that shouldn't exist, you call me, or call Daniel. We know now, we believe, and we'll fight." After Pete left, Chris sat at his table for a long time, paging through the journals, looking at the drawings. He thought about sealing the box, about throwing it away, about pretending none of this had happened. Instead, he got up and added his own entry to the journals. He documented the encounter with Grigore Popescu, noted the methods that had worked and those that hadn't, recorded everything he could remember about the creature's behavior and weaknesses. He drew the protective symbols from the cave walls, copied them precisely, explained their significance, and at the bottom of his entry he wrote, "For the next ranger who stumbles across something impossible, for the next person who stops at the edge of the gorge because something whispers danger in the back of their mind, trust your instincts. Bring silver, bring ash wood, bring fire, bring friends, and remember, the folklore exists for a reason. People have been fighting these things for millennia. Learn from them, honor their knowledge, survive." He signed it, dated it, and closed the journal. Outside, the November wind howled through the pines, and somewhere in the darkness, something that might have been a wolf howled back. Chris listened to the sound, his hand resting on the box of journals, and wondered how many other things were out there in the wilderness, ancient and hungry, waiting for the unwary. He didn't know. But if he ever encountered them, at least now he'd be prepared. At least now, he wouldn't stop at the edge of the gorge. At least now, Marcus's death would mean something. Chris turned off the lights in his cabin and went to bed, but he didn't sleep well. He dreamed of caves and reflective eyes, of voices in the dark promising transformation and immortality. He dreamed of Rachel Hoffman screaming his name, of Marcus Chen disappearing into shadow, of a man named Grigore Popescu waking up in a grave in 1891 and clawing his way toward the surface, toward the light, toward the hunger that would define the next century of his existence. When Chris woke at dawn, he was clutching Pete's grandfather's journals against his chest like a talisman, like a promise, like proof that evil could be fought and sometimes even defeated. But the dreams didn't stop. They never stopped. And every time he went out on a search and rescue, every time he entered the deep places of Glacier National Park, Chris Brennan carried an ash wood stake in his pack and a silver riveted knife on his belt. Just in case. Just to be prepared. Just to remember that the folklore exists for a reason, and that some debts take a lifetime to repay. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Marcus Chen 8 years ago.